Over the last couple of weeks, we've been walking through the Lenten season. We started a couple weeks ago with this question: do you want to know what God is like? Do you want to know what God is like? It was a question that was centered around a volitional decision, a decision of our will. And then last week, we kind of dove right into the Easter story and that began way back in Genesis 3. We've heard over the years that Easter is the answer. Easter is the answer. And last week we talked about, well, if Easter is the answer, what is the question? And that question is centered around what we cannot do for ourselves. That sinful nature that we are born into. And that is something that no matter how hard we work at, no matter where we find our resources, we just cannot overcome that on our own. Today, I want to continue that thought and kind of piggyback and dovetail into this mission of Jesus Christ. But before we begin, I want to ask a question. Have you ever actually been through something where when it was over, you asked this question or you made this response? I learned my lesson. Have you ever been through something or done something, and then afterwards, as you look back on it, you say, man, I just learned my lesson. My high school had a lifeguarding class. Man, I was stoked about that. In my junior and senior year, I wanted to become a lifeguard because, hey, look, getting paid to sit by the pool all day, who could beat that? There were two things that our instructor said and wanted us to grasp a hold of. The first one was, don't sit there. There was this. You've seen these railings, right? You're sitting on a railing. That's what I was doing. I was sitting on a railing. And to this day, I think this was intentional. Somebody came up behind me and nudged me, and I started to slide forward. And I did not have the presence of mind to let go and catch myself. And so what caught the floor was my face. And I've looked better ever since. But no, I broke several teeth in the front of my I got dental x-rays to show him. It was really gruesome and ugly. But anyways, don't sit there. I learned my lesson. As the semester went on, we started to hear this next thing that our instructor said over and over and over again. And she would say this: don't try to save somebody who doesn't want to be saved. Don't try to save somebody who doesn't want to be saved. Now, as she said that at the beginning, it became clearer as the semester went on what she meant. Because what she knew, what we didn't know, was as we are lifeguarding, and when we see somebody struggling to stay above water, and we jump in, which we're supposed to, and we're supposed to swim out to that person. One of the things that started to unfold here as we started to think about what she said was, if that person continues to struggle, even though your arm is around them and you're doing the side stroke back in, you should stop until they stop struggling. Because what she said was, you both will go underwater and you both have the potential of drowning. Now, it's interesting how she said to fix this. When you grab a hold of the person and they're still struggling, you're supposed to put them underwater again. That doesn't sound very nice, does it? But to get them an idea that, I'm here to save you. Stop struggling. Stop putting yourself in, and both of us, into danger. The hope was that in this hopeless state, or this hopelessness, that they would stop struggling, because you can't save somebody who has not yet realized that they need to be saved. To be saved, to be rescued, you've got to first understand and believe and realize that you need to be saved. And this is true in just about any of the areas of our lives, but specifically, think about the relationships we have with other people. Think about the relationships that we have when the two of you are living in the existence of feeling disconnected with each other. Not necessarily spatially, not necessarily in proximity, because they can live in your house and you could still feel very, very disconnected with that person. They may live close by, but there have been certain circumstances and certain things that have happened that the relationship becomes more and more disconnected. And before you know it, you live in the house, but you're just not able to communicate, not able to make a connection, not able to grow that relationship. Now, you can think of this happening not only in families where husbands and wives find themselves in this, not only with parents and children, but you start to see this with yourself and other people in your lives when it comes to people that you work with, people you play with. And if you're a teenager, maybe people that you go to school with. I mean, when you think of it, this idea of relationships, you can find yourself disconnected, and it's not necessarily a spatial problem. Many times it is a relational problem. It's a relational problem. And there's this gap that exists between us. Even though we might be close in proximity, we're disconnected. Now, what needs to happen in your mind, in your eyes, in your opinion? What needs to happen to reconnect with that person? What needs to happen when you finally realize that you are disconnected? There's a distance relationally between the two of you. What needs to happen? Now, I want you to keep that question in the back of your mind because we'll come back to it. This disconnection that we have with people only becomes exasperated, only becomes greater when we find ourselves living into the labels and the adjectives and the words that people use to describe us. Because of a certain situation, we are disconnected between two people, and then the labels come. Well, that person's a liar. And they start telling people that they're a liar, and the distance relationally only grows and grows and grows. It might start with an event, but it grows and it becomes exasperating. It becomes multiplied with the labels. Oh, that person is a cheater, or that person is dishonest, or that person is just not good enough, never does anything that he or she says that he or she will do, or that person's just not my people. It's just not a part of my group. Now you can think how this unfolds in middle schools, where boys and girls, they try to fit in with certain groups. But for one reason or another, there is this label. There is this disconnect. And no matter how hard they struggle, no matter how hard they try to reconnect and do it themselves, they are not successful. They can't pay money. They can't do enough good things. They can't find themselves in places where the playing field is leveled. And the unfortunate thing is that we start to live into these labels. I mean, it starts with an event, yes, but we start to believe what other people are saying about us, and we start to believe what we are saying about somebody else. Well, my son or my daughter, they never do anything right. And we say that, and they say that, and they start to hear that. They start to believe it. Well, I'm not good enough. There's nothing I can do to reconnect. And just as easy that you can imagine this happening between people, this happens in our relationships with God. It's not a spatial disconnect. It's not something that we have left God physically or God has left us physically, but it's a relationship disconnect. And when we talked about last week that contrast that Adam and Eve had before Genesis 3, and then that lack of connection with God they had after Genesis 3, you start to see this unfold in a very, very real way. They were able to walk with God. They were able to converse freely, uninhibited. And then, afterwards, it became a struggle where death entered the world. And over the centuries, time and time, generation to generation, it unfolded that this is the way you reconnect with God. Through sacrifice, through offering, through doing, through discipline, through spiritual growth or whatever. And it became so ingrained that the prophets eventually said, you've missed it. It's not about the doing as much as it's about being. And there's nothing you can do. You can't struggle enough. You can't do enough good things to fix that which has disconnected us from God. One of the things that we discover about Jesus in the scriptures is that we start to see and we start to discover that the way Jesus described people, the way that Jesus labeled people was a lot different. It was totally different than the way that the people labeled themselves or others. And the way the other religious leaders labeled people. I mean, it's fascinating but it's true about Jesus, and this is something that Andy Stanley said. He said, the people who liked Jesus were nothing like Jesus. And he liked them back. The people who liked Jesus, the people who had this gravitational pull to Jesus, were nothing like Jesus. And still, Jesus liked them back. I mean, we would imagine that the religious leaders would be the people that Jesus would gravitate towards. We would imagine it was the scribes and the Pharisees and the high priests and the temple workers and all those people that were in the midst of the central push of the religious movement in first century. That Jesus would say, this is where I need to go. These are my people. These are the people I need to hang out with. But those were the people that exasperated the lowliness and the marginalized people by using labels. I mean, you can look in Luke chapter 15. It says, now the tax collectors and the sinners were all drawing near to him. Look at the way that the people identified each other. I mean, tax collectors were even below the sinners. They were a label of themselves. So they had a hierarchical way of labeling people by saying these tax collectors and these sinners were drawing near to Jesus. And the religious leaders, they're watching this happen. And in the second verse it says, and the Pharisees and the scribes, they grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners. Notice that they don't even use, the Pharisees didn't even want to say tax collectors. That's how low the tax collectors were. He says he receives sinners and he eats with him. This is not just in this one area, but this is over and over. When Jesus interacts with these people who are the religious leaders, you start to see these contrasts between Jesus describing people and the religious leaders describing people. And thus we get to our story of Zacchaeus. I mean, it's a story I hope we all are very familiar with, so I'm not going to read it. Jesus is approaching town. Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector, the low of the low, the one that the Pharisees wouldn't even say their names, wouldn't even say the label, says, I've got to see Jesus. And because he was a man of small stature, he found a tree and he climbed up the tree. I'll get it out, my phonics. He climbed up the tree just so he could see Jesus. And when Jesus came and passed by that tree, Jesus stopped. And he looks up to the tax collector and says, Zach, come on down. You and I are going to have dinner tonight. I'm going to eat with you. And you could have cut the tension with a knife. Because that's not the label the Pharisees would have used. They wouldn't even have used his real name. They would have pushed them aside. They would have said, you, Zacchaeus, are not even worth a glance. When Jesus realized that there was some grumbling after this incident with Zacchaeus, he says his mission. He says, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. I love that. I mean, just think about it. What if Jesus just came to seek the lost? What if Jesus was the one who says, I am a lost identifier? And he would come and you might find yourself lost, maybe with proximity, and you're lost driving and you're in a place where you're unfamiliar, and Jesus would just come up and say, hey, you're lost. And he would turn and walk away. What if Jesus was the one who came and said, you're a sinner? What if Jesus came and said, you are not worthy? What if Jesus just came to point his finger and tell us all the labels that people have been giving you? You're a cheater. You're a liar. You're not my people. But Jesus' mission was not only to seek them out, the ones who had been marginalized, pushed to the outskirts, but to save them. For the Son of Man had come to seek and save the lost. Now, fairly quickly, what I want to do is I want to walk through very quickly and briefly 3 very quick and short parables that happen in Luke chapter 15. And once again, if you remember that slide just a few minutes ago, the crowd is following Jesus, and they're gathering around, and the people who are not like Jesus are drawn to Jesus. And the labels that people are putting on these outsiders, they grumbled, and Jesus uses these 3 parables. The man with the lost sheep leaves the 99, finds the one, brings them back. Now, this is something we don't understand today, but everyone who was a man in his audience then would say, yep, that's what you do. You leave the 99, you go find the one, you come back. And with a little bit of hyperbole, a little bit of exaggeration, you call your friends together, you have a party, you celebrate. For the one that was lost has been found. You seek it out. You find it. You bring it back. And then the next story, the next parable. Suppose there's a woman who's lost a coin. And every woman is saying, yep, I'd search my house. I'd turn it upside down. I'd set the other 9 aside, and I would find that one coin. And when they found it, they would call their friends with a bit of exaggeration. They would have a party, and they would all celebrate because the one coin that was lost was sought out. It was found. And then Jesus moves into a father and a son. The son comes to the father and says, I don't want to wait until you die to get my inheritance. So what I want you to do is I want to play a game where we pretend you're dead. And I want you to divide I want my inheritance now. And then all the men and the women in the crowd who were agreeing with the sheep and the coin, their jaws dropped. When Jesus said, and the Father did it. And the Father said, and let the Son go and squander. And everybody probably muttered and grumbled more and said, that Father is a fool. Why in the world is this Jesus saying that this father is going to let this son go? Because the father knew that in order to reconnect, he could not force a connection upon that son. The son had to realize that he was lost. The son had to realize that he was disconnected. And when Jesus concludes this story, you, for the first time, get an idea of the labels Jesus uses. He says, for my son was dead and alive again. For my son was lost, and he is found. I mean, can you imagine the questions coming up in the people in the audience's minds? That the father watches on the road as the son leaves. And when the son comes back with a prepared story, a prepared argument, a prepared solution, he runs after that son. Why didn't the father run after the son to keep him from going? Because the son needed to know that he had become disconnected with God. And the only way he could reconnect was the father knew that the son had to believe that first. Isn't it interesting that these Pharisees and these religious leaders are more concerned about a coin and a sheep than they are about a son? They celebrate the shepherd leaving the 99 to find the one. They celebrate the woman who sets the 9 aside to find the one. But when the father in his mind is trying to reconnect, lets his son go in order to get him back, they thought he was a fool. Jesus said the labels that God uses for us is not cheater, sinner, liar. Not even, you're not my people. It's all centered around the mission of being lost and found. You know what's interesting is when we lose something of value, we go to great lengths to find it, don't we? We go to great lengths to find it. There was a time when Lisa and I, when John and Anna were younger, we went to Disney World. Walt Disney World, you know, the castle and all that kind of stuff. and there are thousands of people around. What if I was in charge of the kids? To make sure that they're safe. And Lisa was going to go and shop somewhere, and it was my job to watch the kids. What if I looked around and Anna was missing? I mean, you know, Anna, where are, and when there was no response, you could imagine the anxiety level growing. And I wouldn't, you know, maybe I wouldn't worry where John was. Maybe he was lost too at that point when I'm looking for Anna. I mean, could you imagine the conversation that Lisa and I would have? I mean, listen, sweetheart, I want you to know that I lost Anna, but I want you to know I have John. I mean, that wouldn't be good enough, would it? I mean, we find ourselves, when we lose something of great value, we go to lengths. There is no excuse. We go to great lengths to find it. And this is what Jesus does. This is what Christ does. This is what God does through Jesus. He said, the question is, do you know how valuable you are in God's eyes? Do you know how valuable you are? The lengths that he has gone to reconnect us back. And we find ourselves in places where we just struggle. If I just do more, if I sacrifice more, if I give more, will I ever feel fulfilled? And you never will. If you continually try to struggle to do it yourself. There must be a moment where in the place of hopelessness, you reach out and come to your senses and say, I am disconnected with God. I might still come to his house. I might still worship. I might still find myself praying and reading scripture, but there is a disconnect with me and God. And the majority of the times that happens is centered around unconfessed sin. Where we just have rationalized this. Where we have just allowed ourselves to live in an area where this just might be okay, and we start labeling it. Or we might just start believing the labels that we're not good enough and we have no value, and we just have this Eeyore type of attitude, well, that's just the way it is. And we never find ourselves reconnecting back with God. Or maybe, just maybe, we don't reconnect back with God, and we don't even connect in the first place with God because there is this question, or the way that we look at Jesus as just, man, that was 2,000 years ago. Man, that's what I learned in Sunday school or vacation Bible school or camp. I mean, what does that really have to do with today? Everything. Because when Jesus claims to forgive sins, he is claiming to be God. And when he says, I'm going to be the judge of the world, do you know what he's doing? He's claiming to be God. And unlike the founders of other religions, and unlike the other people of the Bible, and unlike other prophets who pointed to God, Jesus is not one more person just pointing to God. He is God, to whom all other people are pointing. Doesn't that force your hand a little bit? I mean, when it comes to following Christ, when it comes to being found, when it comes to realizing that we are disconnected, when we are reconnected, then we have to set everything else aside and we run and we fall at the feet of Christ and worship him as God, because there can never be any halfway measures to following Christ. There can't be every other day that we want to follow Christ, or moments in certain places. It's either everything or nothing, because God never intended it to be any other way. To bring this to a conclusion, I think C.S. Lewis says it best when it comes to how we are to respond to the one who is sent to reconnect us back to God. I think he says it great. He says, I am trying here to prevent anyone from saying, this is in Mere Christianity, the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. I'm ready to follow Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. This is the one thing we must never say. A man who was merely man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic or a liar. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he is a madman or something worse. You can shut him up as a fool, you can spit at him, and you can kill him. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great teacher. He has not left that open to us. He never intended to. He is either the God who spoke and created the world, or he is a lunatic. But halfway measures of living in the sense of never realizing that you're disconnected or lost, that's not an option. When Jesus died on the cross, the gap that was created between us and God in Genesis 3 was bridged. You and I could never have done that on our own. You and I try to, but we can't. And we must find ourselves in a place where we realize that we have been disconnected. And the only way to be reconnected is to live into the labels and the ways that God identifies us. We are lost. And he has found us. Just imagine. Just imagine what your world would be like if maybe for the first time or the 50th time you started to live into the labels that God uses instead of every other label that people use. What if you finally believe that you are God's? You are great value. And he has gone to great length to reconnect. Gracious Heavenly Father, we ask, O God, that you would continue to allow your Spirit to weave this into the fabric of our hearts. That your mission to seek and to save is a mission designed to reach us. So may it be, O God. In your name we pray.